Hey everybody, so good to see you. It's been a real day of childcare at our PH Ally. This morning I had my two little boys, and we get Marina's little ones hopefully with us today with another exciting episode of the Herbalism Show. We're going to jump into the art and science of herbalism here, and we are going to click this reel and get rocking. All right, so Marina, the art and science of herbalism. I feel like this is a wonderful topic to go as broad as possible, but I know you'll narrow us down into kind of the details that you wanted to cover. With it being kind of considered an art, I feel like way too often you're someone that I know is really good about bringing in all the scientific details behind it because we are pharmacy nerds, so that's something we do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I would argue that a lot of medicine, and my baby apparently is arguing alongside with me. A lot of medicine, and I actually just wrote a blog post. If you're interested, I'll share about the history of medicine. So, as we talked about before in the theme and topic of whole medicine, whole herb and whole plant, food and medicine, it originated in every part of the globe.
In case you're worried, she's cooing, but we can hear you perfect. So don't even worry.
Great. So every single culture from the origin and the prehistoric times that we see and have established to human roots, right? Us originating as the human species, yes. We have studied that we have co-evolved with plants and other kingdoms of living organisms and have utilized them as both food and medicine and shelter and every possible beneficial quality that it can offer us, that we tapped into what is available abundantly in nature for our own benefit, right? So that's kind of historically how we co-evolved. And then when we learned what foods we can eat, and then what medicine we can use from these plants and mushrooms and other species and kingdoms, we take some seaweeds, we take the algae, we take the blue-green bacteria. So we kind of use everything again to our advantage. And so now, for the last 100 or so years, we've really focused on the scientific and evidence-based medicine modalities. And there's some political and social reasons for that. And they are quite limited to our continent in North America for the majority of my argument here. So other parts of the globe still consistently have been polled by the World Health Organization, and statistics as high as 70 to 80% of the global population is still utilizing plant medicine in some form. So to say that there is no validity and no evidence to plant medicine is, I think, completely ignorant and not true, because we historically have seen that they are used, again, as both food and medicine. And then there is this gray area. Well, what is food and what is medicine, right? Food is preventative. Food is nutritive. We need food to survive. If we had no food, we can't survive, right? Over maybe 2 weeks, we can survive without food. So we do need to always go back to the basics of what we need for survival, which is number one, air, right? So air quality is important. Number two, water. Number three, food. And so plants play this integral role where a lot of the times they do serve some nutritive qualities for us, which I keep talking about. And then they also support detoxification, which is also important because we want to process wasteful and harmful toxins out of the body. So plants are this backbone that is just multicultural, that is, has its origins in indigenous peoples from all over using it. And then nowadays, it's still relevant, right? We are still eating food. We're not just eating drugs all day long, right? So we are still eating food. So we still need to know our plants. And we still, in one way or another, are practicing this art of herbalism, whether we know it or not, because all the term herbalism really means is we're using plants for our benefits, for supporting the body to do its functions and processes. So when we're drinking coffee, when we are drinking tea, right? If you're not drinking coffee, a lot of times you're drinking tea. If we're drinking beer or other fermented beverages or kombucha, if we are even people who are smoking or using cannabis or tobacco products, cigarettes, all of these things are things that we see all the time, and they could be used for good or for bad, right? And they could be addictive, and they could be medicinal.
That's so, I love the way you just painted that, because it brings me back to the question that I kind of had when you opened up with the art elements of, there is some refinement. And oftentimes in like the last 100 years, especially when we really transitioned over to this like purist evidence. I love how you use evidence-based, and you and I both are like tongue in cheek with some of that. But with the evidence-based kind of movement beforehand, like when we were looking at traditional medicines, that had kind of been cultivated and curated, when we think of modern medicine, Marina, we think of someone in a laboratory environment trying to look at ligands and receptors and chemical structures and being able to fit those together, or being able to take substances they're seeing some kind of benefit from, purify those down, test oftentimes rodents on these individual substances and see what the results are, and then move them up in the trial, process, right? I might not have done a great job with that, but there's my Kevin overview. But before we went into this kind of medicinal process with herbs, Marina, give us some of that kind of background. I feel like that would really help folks to be able to understand like what were traditional herbalists doing to be able to incorporate some of these things that they're finding in the field into their medicinal practices.
Yeah, so for me, the art is really just noticing and observing, right? Observing and noticing what is happening and what's working and correlating things. Whereas the science is really finding out how it's working, right? The mechanism behind what's actually going on and which constituents are activating what. And so it's really exciting, but they're not mutually exclusive. You can do both together. And just because there hasn't been an exact proposed mechanism or a hypothesis that's been studied, research, published, and has the highest degree of the evidence-based scale, doesn't mean that something doesn't work, right? They're two different things. So one side of the coin is just knowing and following the tradition and developing systems, and again, passing this information down. And clinical practice, as we know, is also very different from abstract and neat laboratory environments. And there's so many things and factors going on in real life versus a nice clinical controlled, univariable environment. So it's not like real life is a walking science experiment. Everything is literally an experiment that can, change at any point.
No, it's so true. And I just pulled up the graphic you and I were talking about before to really kind of illustrate, their traditional herbalism. The couple things to understand is it's not randomly assigning or grabbing something from a field and trying to see if it works. Like that is not the case at all. Getting very specific on the amount that is being utilized, who is utilizing it, when they're utilizing it, how they're applying it. There's a deep level of science. And then when we go even further, we can see that there's lots of scientific reviews and literature around several plant species, what's been studied, the results of those studies, their individual findings. And Marina, when we're going into the science piece, and I don't need to leave this graphic up for too long, but just in general, like when you're looking across this kind of the scientific breakdowns of some of the things that are there, you as an herbalist that has a pharmacy, background and skill set, what are you looking at, Marina, with the science in particular?
Yes, I appreciate you asking that and pulling up the graphic. And all that is to say that, yes, it is difficult. There are confounding variables when studying plants, which is why it is kind of nice and neat to just isolate extract and see how things are, working in a pretty much vacuum. But in real life, we have all of these whole plants, right, that have lots and lots of constituents. And they can either have a synergistic effect and overall net positive benefit. They could have something to watch out for in terms of how it's metabolized, how it affects pharmacokinetics, how it affects other substance pharmacodynamics, right? So we do have to be careful. And then some of the constituents are potentially toxic too. So we do need to know and understand that which plants are generally safe, right? Like generally recognized as safe, which are more of like the food nutritive type plants. And so it is important to categorize, right? And then within those categorize, look for, either the constituents or the energetic qualities, which we can go into another episode on that, what that means. And that's kind of more of the art as well, because we have things that we all agree on, right? That are factual or that are measurable. So that's nice and it fits into science. But sometimes when it goes into the subjective realm and it requires this, skill and experience and perspective, that kind of goes back to the art form. So when I'm looking at data and literature and all these things, and there's great resources nowadays, and I could share with those of you who are interested some of my trusted and reputable references that I've put together as a guide. But things like, Memorial Sloan Kettering has a plant monograph database. And what I look for is, does it have the common name of the plants that people might be asking about or referring to? Does it have the botanical or Latin name, right? The taxonomy? Does it describe what part of the plant is traditionally used, right? Because when we're studying things and wanting the evidence, we need to make sure we have the right plants, which is why the species and the taxonomy is important. Then we need to know if we have the right part of the plant, because often there's some constituents and some actions that are present in one part of the plant, like the leaf, but not the root, or vice versa, or maybe the flower is used or the seed. So there is a different growing cycle then that we need to consider when harvesting the plant and when getting that particular part, where most of the concentration and the energy of the plant as it's growing is going into a particular part, right? So we want to harvest the roots when it's almost about time for winter, because they're going to concentrate all those starches underground for wintertime.
You couldn't have a better like interlaced art and science description than that. I mean, that's really perfect. I mean, I think of like in herbalism, I know we're running up on time, but within herbalism, the art element is what Marina described there, of knowing how to compile all of these individual components into something that now is not only palatable, right? We have to be able to actually consume it one way or another, or be able to apply it one way or the other, but also have the scientific backing in order to use the appropriate parts at the appropriate times. And I think the references, that's a great thing. If you guys want to see some of those references and some of the things that Marina uses to be able to validate what she's using in herbalism, head on over to her channel at the Herbalism channel on rphally.com. Join us there. Ask Marina any questions that you have that come up, and we will see you next week for another really exciting episode. Marina, I just have to say, you were very impressive. Moms around the world, my hands are up to you, because you being able to keep everything kind of zoned in with a beautiful little girl cooing along the way it was amazing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sticking with me. Hopefully it wasn't too distracting, but we have another episode next week to clear up any confusion and talk more about art and science and herbalism.
Love it. We'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.